capable speaker, and tonight he's taking on a topic for which he's written a book. Would you bring books to sell, Bob?
Victor Arnautoff was arguably the most prominent muralist in Northern California during the 1930s, a time when federal funds produced more public art than in any comparable period before or since. His experience tells us interesting things about the arts in the larger Bay Area from the 1920s through the 1950s, about the experiences of Russians who left Russia at the time of that country's civil war, and about the experiences of those accused of being communists in the 1950s. Arnautoff was born in 1896 in a small village near the city of Mariupol in what was then southern Russia. His father was a Russian Orthodox priest. Young Victor studied at the local gymnasium and was such a promising art student that he received special tutoring. He planned to become an artist. But in 1914, all of Europe went to war. Young Victor was rushed through his final year of school and then sent to cavalry officer school. He was commissioned an ensign and later promoted to lieutenant and decorated for bravery in action. But he later wrote, "My position in the regiment was difficult and intellectual, but not of the gentry, separated from the soldiers by my rank and not yet an officer of the nobility." The Russian army was poorly supplied, poorly trained, and poorly led. Arnautoff later wrote, "I saw all I needed to of the stupid tyranny of officers, the ineptitude of command, the mud, and the deprivation." The imperial government collapsed in February 1917. In November, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. Lenin soon approved a draconian peace treaty with Germany that took Russia out of the war but surrendered large parts of the country. The peace treaty marked the beginning of civil war between the Bolsheviks' Red Army and the Whites, a loose alliance of several anti-Bolshevik groups. Arnautoff joined one of the White armies in Simbirsk, over here, on the Volga River, in July of 1918. After some initial victories, his part of the White Army engaged in a 2-year-long retreat all the way across Siberia, some 3,800 miles, about the distance from San Francisco to Nova Scotia. Imagine doing that on horseback in the middle of winter. He went first to Harbin, here, in northeastern China, where he tried to scratch out a living by painting icons and lacquer boxes while he attended a local art school. He soon found that he could learn a decent living by going to Mukden and working for Zhang Zhaolin, the local warlord. Arnautoff's job was to work with the cavalry in Mukden. There he met and married Lydia Blonsky, the daughter of a former colonel in the Imperial Russian Army. Lydia soon gave birth to two boys, Michael and Vasily. Arnautoff still wanted to become an artist. Lydia's father offered to pay his tuition at the California School of Fine Arts, which is now called the San Francisco Art Institute. And Arnautoff set off for San Francisco in late 1925, leaving his wife and sons with the Blonskys, and ending the 10-year-long detour from his goal of becoming an artist. He studied with some of the leading artists in the West, and he initially wanted to become a sculptor. But by 1928 or 1929, he had become attracted to doing large public murals, and he painted this self-portrait. He came to see art as having an obligation to bring a message to as wide an audience as possible. His first public mural is still in place in the old Cathedral of the Holy Virgin on Fulton Street here in San Francisco. It is done in fresco, painted on wet plaster rather than on canvas. If you are familiar with that building, it may seem strange to find a fresco mural in a redwood structure. This mural was done in the same way that students at the California School of Fine Arts were learning fresco, not by painting on a wall, but by constructing a wooden frame for the plaster and painting on it much like painting on canvas. Arnautoff's student visa expired in 1929 and he had to leave the US. Ralph Stackpole, a leading faculty member at the school, encouraged Arnautoff to go to Mexico and to work with Diego Rivera. Rivera and Stackpole had been friends since their student days in Paris. Rivera was, at the time, the most prominent muralist in the world, based on his use of fresco to create large public murals depicting Mexican history. He developed a distinctive style based on large simplified figures and bold colors. He had been active in the Mexican Communist Party, but had recently been expelled for his bourgeois tendencies. The Arnautoff family arrived in Mexico in June of 1929. Rivera hired Arnautoff as an assistant, and he learned every step in creating a fresco. Frescoes are painted on wet plaster. The paint penetrates the wet plaster, so it is more permanent than something painted just on the surface. But a fresco artist must work very quickly and decisively to complete each section before the plaster dries. Rivera and Arnautoff spent long hours working together on the large murals at the Cortez Palace in Cuernavaca. Arnautoff was the model for this figure hanging from a tree, and he tells in his memoirs that Rivera had him hanging from a ladder for hours. Arnautoff said later that Rivera taught him the conceptual difference between the small frescoes he had done at the California School of Fine Arts and painting on an entire wall. This is one of Rivera's largest and most celebrated murals at the National Palace in Mexico City, depicting the sweep of Mexican history and emphasizing the Revolution of 1910. In the closing days of 1930, Stackpole had arranged for Rivera to receive commissions in San Francisco, and Rivera left Arnautoff in charge of this work at the National Palace. Stackpole had persuaded the head of the San Francisco Stock Exchange to bring Rivera to do this mural in the new Stock Exchange building. Arnautoff was supposedly the model for the lumberjack in the center of the mural. While Rivera was in the city, he also did a mural at the California School of Fine Arts and one in a private home. In May of 1931, the Arnautoff family, now including a third son, Jacob, returned to San Francisco as permanent residents eligible for citizenship. Arnautoff set up a studio and soon attracted public attention, first by exhibiting his paintings from Mexico, and then by painting this fresco mural in his studio, 8 by 24 feet, featuring himself and other young painters along with one of their models. We have only this black and white photograph of it, but of course the original was in color. News about Arnautoff's mural made it into all 4 of the city's daily papers, but only one published a photograph after adding some clothes on the model. In 1932, Arnautoff received a commission for several murals at the new Palo Alto Medical Clinic. It's no longer used as a medical clinic, but the building is still there and the murals are still in good shape. The murals celebrate the medical triumphs of the time. Arnautoff drew upon his experience with Rivera to create smaller murals in grayscale, called grisaille, which contrasted ancient medicine with the color presentations of modern medicine. The murals occasioned a traffic jam in Palo Alto as residents flocked to confirm that bare breasts were on public view. Adeline Kent Howard, one of Arnautoff's fellow students from the 1920s, commissioned this mural for her studio. It does not survive, and again, all we have is this black and white photograph. And here again, you can note Arnautoff's use of grisaille along each side of the center panel. The next year, greater opportunities opened up in May of 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had been recently inaugurated as president, asked Congress to fund the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to provide work relief for the unemployed. The first time ever that the federal government took any responsibility for unemployment relief. Late in 1933, Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins created the Civil Works Administration, CWA, which included the Public Works of Art Project for unemployed artists. The PWAP lasted only from December 1933 to April 1934, but other New Deal programs for artists followed the following year. Together, all these programs opened the way for an outpouring of public art all across the United States. Arnautoff produced art for every one of the New Deal arts programs, the PWAP, the State Emergency Relief Administration, the WPA, and the Treasury section. The largest and most influential PWAP project is at Coit Tower in San Francisco. For all PWAP art projects, the subject matter was specified to be the American scene, and the subject matter for the Coit Tower murals was specified to be California at the present time, late 1933 and early 1934. Arnautoff was chosen for the City Life mural and was also appointed as technical director for the entire project because he had more experience with fresco murals than any of the other artists. Critics praised Arnautoff's mural, and the district director called him the most gifted of the local muralists. In his mural, Arnautoff created a complex and richly detailed portrait of downtown San Francisco, from major civic structures to a modest filling station and dozens of people from all walks of life. He had to work around a door in the center of the wall, which he made into the back door of a newsstand. On the right side of his mural, he depicted the produce market, which linked his mural to the agricultural murals around the corner to the right. On the left side, he presented industrial scenes linking to the industrial murals that were on that side of the building. Arnautoff presented the Pacific Coast Stock Exchange, this building, with an automobile accident in front, perhaps his way of depicting the stock market crash. The fire engine over here has a number 5 on it, which is likely intended as an homage to Lily Hitchcock Coit, the funder of the tower, who was an honorary member of Engine Company number 5. To the left of the newsstand, Arnautoff depicted a well-dressed man being robbed by 2 other well-dressed men, perhaps his comment on life in the financial district. On the right side of the newsstand is a newsboy modeled on Arnautoff's son Michael, and a self-portrait. He's the one in the gray hat. Arnautoff's politics had begun to move left under Rivera's influence. These woodcut prints were done after the Coit Tower mural during the 1934 longshore and maritime strikes, which he later said caused him to see the inequities in American economic life. He did several such works in the 1930s and after. He saw public murals as a way to bring art to a wide public, and he considered multiple prints of works such as these as another way to bring art to a larger public, as well as to bring his own form of social criticism. Late in 1934, Arnautoff was commissioned to do a mural in this building at the Presidio of San Francisco. The mural is on the east side of the building, left side in this picture, and it's visible from the outside if you ever want to go take a look at it. I couldn't get the entire mural into one photograph. The center of the mural is a statue of St. Francis, of course. You all know the Presidio, the bay, and the city were all named for St. Francis. On the left side, as one faces the mural, Arnautoff shows the history of the Presidio, beginning with Native Americans. Moving clockwise around that side, the mural shows the encounter of the indigenous people of the Presidio with the representatives of Imperial Spain. In the upper left, Arnautoff depicts the romantic and highly romanticized story of Concepcion Arguello, daughter of the commandant of the Presidio, and Nikolai Razanov, a visiting Russian nobleman from Russian North America. At the top center on that side is the only surviving structure from the Spanish Presidio, and the history section concludes with the arrival of Americans. The other side of the mural shows the activities of the Army as of 1934, beginning with aviation and wireless communication, both of which were important at the Presidio. The center of that side depicts the Army's role with the Civilian Conservation Corps, a New Deal agency that put young men to work on environmental projects, including fighting forest fires. The upper right shows the role of the Army Corps of Engineers in designing, building, and operating the Panama Canal. And the final part of the mural shows the Army consulting on the building of the Golden Gate Bridge, which was in progress at that time as Arnautoff was painting the mural. He carefully researched his murals. Here you see some of his sketches for the Native Americans in the mural, along with the originals that he was using as the basis for his sketches. The originals were done by Louis Corris, a Russian artist who visited the Bay Area in 1816. Here's another of Arnautoff's sketches and the original by Corris. Note especially the foxskin quiver for arrows right here, which is unfortunately obscured in this copy of Arnautoff's sketch. And here you see the foxskin quiver. You see the way he's depicted the hairstyles of the various Native Americans. And I suspect he did similar research on the woman's basketry. Just as an example of the kind of research that he did. One of his assistants said that Victor was very clear that everything had to be exactly right, exactly according to the way it originally was. Let me go back a minute and say a bit more. Arnautoff's treatment of Native Americans differs significantly from many previous public representations of them in that he emphasized the complexity and the artistry of the woman's basket work and the man's foxskin quiver. And he showed them meeting the Spanish as equals, not groveling before them in the way that Native Americans are represented in the Pioneer Monument at Civic Center, which was done a generation earlier. Arnautoff's next and largest New Deal project was at George Washington High School, a building funded partly by the Public Works Administration. The WPA's Federal Art Project provided work relief for unemployed artists and funded the extensive artwork at the school. It, I think, is without a doubt the largest collection of New Deal art anywhere in the city. Arnautoff did 13 panels of various sizes, the largest New Deal art project by an individual artist up to that time on the Pacific Coast. They all present different aspects of the life of George Washington. He carefully researched his topic. As he put it, for a long time, nothing but reading. In his murals, Arnautoff presented his understanding of Washington's life and times. I conclude that his developing political perspective, as he moved to the left, led him to present a counter-narrative to the accounts that generally appeared in high school textbooks at the time. This mural, let me go back. This mural depicts Washington's early life as a surveyor and officer in the French and Indian War. But interestingly enough, Arnautoff puts Native Americans in the center of the mural, beset on all sides, by the colonists on one side, by the British and the French. This mural is on the other side as one enters, showing the origin of the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, and in the upper right, Washington taking command. But note that here in the center, Arnautoff puts 5 working-class men raising the new flag of the country. Smaller murals showed events of the Revolution, including the arrival of Lafayette, von Steuben, and Pulaski, the winter at Valley Forge, and the victory over the Hessians at Trenton. Other small murals showed events in Washington's life after the Revolution, including his hope to create a national university and his efforts as president to mediate between Andrew Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Arnautoff's ceiling murals are more symbolic, including this one of Liberty placing 13 new stars in the firmament. 2 large murals are in the upper hall, and they continue Arnautoff's challenge to the usual accounts of Washington's life. This one shows Washington as master of Mount Vernon, but Arnautoff puts enslaved African Americans at the center of the mural, emphasizing the dependence of Washington on the labor of slaves and creating a counter-narrative to most accounts at the time that said little or nothing about the founding fathers being slaveholders. The other large mural presents Washington as a visionary, pointing the nation west. Arnautoff said that he intended this mural to show, quote, the march of the white race from the Atlantic to the Pacific, unquote. But again, with a counter-narrative that makes dramatically clear that the way west was literally over the body of a dead Indian. A counter-narrative to the view in most textbooks at the time that the development of the West involved white settlers moving into vacant land. Arnautoff is making clear that the West was already inhabited and that settlement was also an act of conquest. At the time, the critics praised Arnautoff's work, but they, like generations of later students, probably did not fully absorb Arnautoff's counter-narrative. Here's another example of Arnautoff's meticulous research, his sketches of Hessian uniforms and the way he presented the Hessian surrender at Trenton. He even got the mustache from this one to put it into his mural, and the uniform from this one for the mural. There are 4 surviving sets of sketches of military uniforms for the French and Indian War and the Revolution. By the mid-1930s, Arnautoff ranked among the leading artists in San Francisco. In 1936, the city's art community elected him as King of Perilia, the art community's annual pageant at Civic Auditorium, for which he wore this rather bizarre costume. He was also elected as chairman of the Artists' Council of the San Francisco Art Association, served on the Fine Arts Commission for the Golden Gate International Exposition, and was elected to the board of directors of the Art Association. Several of his works won awards. He also won awards as a competitive fencer. He had learned fencing as a cavalry officer, and he kept up his skills as a member of the Olympic Club fencing team. Arnautoff argued that an artist should also be a social critic. This woodblock print indicates how deeply he was affected by the tragic civil war in Spain, which may have reminded him of his own experience in a bloody civil war. Throughout the time of his greatest acceptance in the art world, he remained deeply homesick for Russia, something he had in common with many other refugees from Bolshevism and civil war. He may also have felt some responsibility for his aging parents, since both his brothers had also fled the Bolsheviks and lived outside the Soviet Union. In 1936, Victor and Lydia applied for permission to move to the Soviet Union and become Soviet citizens, but they were turned down because of his and Lydia's connections to the whites. 2 years later, they secretly joined the Communist Party, perhaps partly as a way of persuading the Soviets to admit them as immigrants. Unknown to Arnautoff, 1938 was also the year when the NKVD executed his father, his uncle, and his cousin. Being turned down for immigration undoubtedly saved his life. In 1937, Arnautoff received the first of 5 commissions for post office murals. One aspect of the New Deal stimulus program was the construction of many new federal buildings, especially post offices, and nearly all the new post offices had an American scene mural. Previous art in federal buildings had tended to be as classical as the architecture, but the new murals all presented the American scene, past or present. Commissions for federal buildings were awarded on the basis of merit. This was not work relief. All of Arnautoff's post office murals were oil on canvas, painted in his studio rather than on site. This mural for College Station, Texas is the only one of Arnautoff's New Deal murals that has not survived. It shows the back-breaking toil of black sharecroppers and the easier life of white Texans, as well as the wealth from oil in the distance. We have the black sharecroppers picking cotton going this way and going in the opposite direction as a white Texan on a modern tractor. Edward Rowan, the superintendent of the program for art in the new federal buildings, called it a consummate work of art, but said nothing about Arnautoff's message about the contrast between the lives of black Texans and those of white Texans. Arnautoff's second post office mural, also in Texas, shows the back-breaking work of picking cotton by hand. The title, The Last Crop, refers to the last time the cotton was picked by hand, as that work was being replaced by machines. The large house in the center is presumably the home of the landowner. In the upper right are small unpainted structures next to a spindly leafless tree, presumably the homes of the African American cotton pickers. As with the College Station mural, Arnautoff depicts the dignity of labor and the economic divide between white Texans and African American Texans. Arnautoff's 2 Texas post office murals are the more striking when one realizes that the 11 African Americans in these 2 murals account for about half of all African Americans in the 69 New Deal post office murals. There's no social criticism apparent in Arnautoff's 3rd post office mural in Pacific Grove, California, but this mural proved to be more controversial than any of the rest. This was Arnautoff's 2nd design for the mural, and you can read here what the official at the Treasury Department had to say about it, that the woman in the bathing suit on the left is distressingly insistent physically. And he told Arnautoff to put her in street clothes, which he did. He complied, but the dress doesn't do a lot to change the lines of the woman's body. Arnautoff's 4th post office mural was for Richmond across the bay. He visited the site, talked with the postmaster and the local newspaper editor, and they decided that the mural should depict the people of Richmond and Richmond's industry. And on the right here, we see 4 longshore workers discussing something in the newspaper, and on the left, we see various citizens going about their daily business, and in the background, we see oil refineries. This one was thought to be lost for a long time, but a year or two ago it was discovered in the basement of the post office, all carefully packed up and by an expert at taking care of art. And they're now trying to raise the funds to restore it so it can be displayed at the Richmond Historical Museum. In late 1941, Arnautoff received his fifth and last commission for a mural in a new post office in South San Francisco. And there he created three separate paintings: a life-size cowboy, signifying the area's history as rangeland for cattle being fattened for San Francisco packing plants, and on the right, a full-size steelworker, signifying the city's industrial present. And as of 1941, a panoramic view of the city in the center. And you can still pick out many of the buildings in downtown South San Francisco from the center mural. Arnautoff had begun teaching in the art department at Stanford University in the spring of 1938. He later explained that this self-portrait, looking very serious, was done in 1941 as Europe and Eastern Asia were both in the midst of war, and the United States seemed likely to be drawn into it. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, Victor and Lydia threw themselves into activities to support the Russian people and the Russian war effort. Here's Arnautoff standing in the back row, helping to promote a public meeting in defense of the Soviet Union. He organized and led a new local organization, the Russian American Society, and served on the National Executive Committee of Russian War Relief and on the local board of the American Russian Institute, another national organization. He later remembered that he had little time for painting during the early years of the war. His public activities on behalf of Russian war relief brought him to the attention of the FBI, which opened a file on him in October of 1941. I conclude that the Arnautoff's work for war relief during World War II cemented their loyalty to the Communist Party. After World War II, in addition to his teaching at Stanford, Arnautoff also taught at the California Labor School, an organization founded and directed by the local Communist Party. The school aimed at a much broader student body. Some classes, notably those in the arts, had minimal political content. Arnautoff taught painting and printmaking. For Arnautoff, the labor school replaced the arts community in which he had been so involved in the 1920s and 30s, especially since the California School of Fine Arts and local art museums had embraced abstract expressionism, a style of painting that Arnautoff found alien to his understanding of the purpose of art. The labor school was closed in 1957 after being put on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. Arnautoff's politics remained on the left. In this self-portrait, he depicted himself in front of a sign reading HR 9490 with a red slash through it. HR 9490 was the Internal Security Act, which required members of the Communist Party to register with the Attorney General and gave the federal government broad powers to exclude or deport suspected communists. In 1944 and 1948, Victor and Lydia again applied for permission to move to the Soviet Union and were again denied. The Soviets still did not trust the former White Army officer, but the FBI kept him and Lydia under constant surveillance because of their involvement with Communist Front organizations and their occasional contacts with Soviet consular officials. In 1955, Arnautoff found himself back in the headlines by exhibiting this print entitled Dick's McSmear at a local art festival. He described it as a composite and symbolic characterization of McCarthyism. After receiving a call from a member of the local FBI office, the head of the art show asked Arnautoff to remove it because it caricatured Vice President Nixon. The official also threatened that if Arnautoff didn't remove it, the entire show would be shut down. Arnautoff removed it because he didn't want to deny his fellow artists the right to show their art. News about this generated a local outpouring of support for Arnautoff, but the festival director assured a reporter that it would all blow over very quickly. It did not. The Nation gleefully put McSmear on its cover the next month, and all major national newspapers reported on the incident. Several papers also listed Arnautoff's ties to the so-called subversive organizations, concluded that he was a communist, and argued that he should be fired by Stanford. Stanford President Wallace Stirling was not amused. He had stated repeatedly that a communist had no place in a college classroom. After outraged Stanford alumni wrote to Stirling demanding that Arnautoff be fired, Stirling asked Arnautoff to talk with him, then sent him to be interviewed by the advisory board, a body elected by the faculty to determine if he should be fired. But that committee decided in Arnautoff's favor. The next year, in 1956, Arnautoff was summoned before a subcommittee of the House Un-American Activities Committee at a hearing in San Francisco. He repeatedly cited the Fifth Amendment in refusing to answer questions about the Communist Party and other organizations, and in refusing to answer questions about whether the Communist Party had told him to make the McSmear cartoon. Arnautoff wrote his own response to the hearing, quote, "The Un-American subcommittee knew very well that I had not committed any crime. An artist has as much right to make a political cartoon as any other citizen has to express a political opinion or viewpoint." Once again, the press contributed to a furor among Stanford alumni over Arnautoff. Once again, he was asked to meet with the advisory board. His answers to their questions emphasized his respect for and commitment to the U.S. Constitution. Again, the advisory board voted against termination. As Arnautoff put it a few years later, figuratively speaking, they put up with me as they might a toothache. Almost 2 years earlier, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union had approved the Arnautoff's fourth application for Soviet citizenship. So while Victor was lecturing the advisory board on the rights of American citizens, he and Lydia had secretly renounced their American citizenship as part of their application to emigrate to the Soviet Union. Of course, their applications were secret, and they had done nothing official in the United States to renounce their citizenship. Victor and Lydia now began to make plans to emigrate after he retired from Stanford. They were very unusual among the Russian emigres of their generation. Many Russian refugees talked longingly of returning to Russia, but very few actually did. In 1961, before they could move, Lydia died after being hit by an automobile. Victor retired from Stanford the next year. He later recalled about that time, "I felt myself an unwanted guest in America." He had lost his wife, he had lost his cultural home in the California Labor School, and he was alienated from two of his sons by his politics. He continued with his plans to emigrate. He left in 1963, taking with him a large number of his paintings, drawings, and prints. Once established in Mariupol, the town where he had grown up, he resumed working on large public murals. This postcard from Arnautoff to his son shows his first mural right here. A 3-story mural in small ceramic tiles on the building that housed the post office and telephone office. He was inspired to use mosaic after seeing medieval mosaic murals in Kiev, perhaps another influence from Rivera, who had encouraged all artists to draw upon the ancient traditions of their own countries. The mural depicts postal workers, but the dominant feature is a Soviet rocket. Today, the mural is deteriorating. It's ironic that most of the murals from the 1930s in the country that he rejected have been better cared for than the murals that he did in the 1960s in the country that he preferred. but it's also a reflection, of course, of the poverty of Ukraine today, and perhaps also the unsettled political status of that part of Ukraine. In 1965, he completed his second mural on the wall of an elementary school, also using small ceramic tiles. And this is his third public mural, inside, also done in mosaic, around the main entry hall of the airport in Mariupol. It's in better shape today, or at least it was the last time that I had any information about it. The title is From the Scythians to the Cosmos, and it presents a Marxist perspective on the history of that region from the earliest times to the space age. These two show ancient battles and the victory of the Red Army in the Civil War, the latter a subject that Arnautoff knew personally. These two show the defeat of the German invasion in World War II and an idealized version of everyday Soviet life at the time Arnautoff was working. In 1968, while he was working on the airport murals, his work at George Washington High School came under attack from African American students. What had been a counter-narrative in the 1930s, asserting the significance of enslaved African Americans, was now considered denigrating. In October of that year, more than 80 black students demanded that all of Arnautoff's murals be destroyed, or at least changed. Arnautoff's sons, Vasily and Jacob, spoke to them and defended the murals, as did other artists, who tried to explain Arnautoff's counter-narrative, that by depicting Washington as a slave owner, Arnautoff had done something unprecedented in the 1930s. That courage, according to the San Francisco Examiner, could mean the destruction of the murals. However, a poll of the school students showed that 61% wanted the murals to be supplemented rather than destroyed. And in the end, that was done. Dewey Crumpler, a young black artist, was commissioned to create 3 new murals. Arnautoff's reaction to this was, "I'm very glad that my frescoes provided the impetus for this new progressive work." Arnautoff remarried to a Russian art critic from Leningrad, where they moved for the final years of his life. He continued painting and etching there, but there were no more public murals. He died in 1979. Raffigier, you all know, did the murals at Rincon Center, which were the last big New Deal art project. So before I answer your question, just remember San Francisco has the first large New Deal art project at Coit Tower and the last one at Rincon Center. Now, did he have influence on Raffigier? He was on the committee that selected Raffigier to do those murals. He had actually hoped to do them himself, but when he was asked to be on the committee, he gave that up in order to serve on the committee. I don't know that he knew Raffigier before, and Raffigier had already done some major studies as a part of his application to do those murals. But once Raffigier came here, he and Arnautoff got along very well. Raffigier also taught at the California Labor School while he was here working on the murals. But I really don't know that there's any documented evidence from Arnautoff to Raffigier. Their styles are rather different. Subject matter, you know, Raffigier's subject matter is all of California history. He also took a critical view of California history. He was also very much on the left. So I suspect it's that larger left cultural milieu that was influencing both of them rather than Arnautoff having some kind of documentable influence on Raffigier.
How did he come to turn to the left after leaving the Soviet Union?
After leaving Russia? Yeah, well, he doesn't say explicitly in his memoirs or anywhere else, so I have to kind of guess about that. But it's clear that his 2 years with Diego Rivera were important in terms of his political thinking. Even though Rivera at the time had been expelled from the Mexican Communist Party, Rivera still considered himself to be a communist with a small c. And Rivera and Arnautoff talked about politics as they were working together day and night in those murals in Cuernavaca. So Arnautoff said that was part of his awakening, political awakening. He also said the 1934 strikes helped to illustrate to him the inequities in the American economic system. And he also says the Spanish Civil War was a very important element in pushing him to the left. Now, he joined the Communist Party in 1938, which is really the height of the Popular Front. My own guess would be that that also may have been part of what attracted him at that time. But I think there were just many elements that went into that kind of a decision to join the Communist Party, including his desire to go and take care of his aged parents. I have some really heartbreaking letters from his mother to Victor saying, "Won't you please come and take care of us in our old age?" And she sent similar letters to her other son who lived in Prague. And I've been in contact with his children. And he also applied to emigrate in 1936 at the same time that Victor did. So I think that maybe that appeal of his parents, together with all the rest of it, may have been a factor in wanting to return and thinking that joining the Communist Party could help in that. That's, it's complicated, but that's the best explanation I can give.
How was he treated in the Soviet Union when he came back?
How was he treated? In Mariupol, he became a major celebrity. He resumed many of the prominent activities he had in San Francisco in the 1930s. He was teaching young artists, he was helping to organize art exhibitions, he was doing major public murals, he had some major exhibitions in Kiev and in Donetsk and in Mariupol, and he was just on top of the world there. And he was being treated extraordinarily well. He had to wait only 6 months to get a new car. The first time in his life he had a new car. He had to wait only 2 years to get his own apartment, which was unheard of, to get an apartment in such a short time, and especially to get an apartment of the size he did. And even before that, he had gotten a studio. Studio had no windows, so it wasn't very good for painting, but he could at least use it to store his materials. So he was treated extraordinarily well in Mariupol. When he and his wife moved to Leningrad, however, he was a very small figure in a very large art community there. And I think that he felt as though, he wasn't being given the proper recognition that he should be given when he was in Leningrad. He did have one small exhibition there, and the critics made fun of some of his work.
Let me follow with, did the Soviets use him for propaganda purposes?
Well, his move there was certainly given a lot of publicity in the Soviet press. And his artwork with the murals in Mariupol was given a lot of publicity in that area. I haven't found anything that the Soviets, well, there was one article about him that was published in a publication here in the US in English about how happy he was being in the Soviet Union. It was a very left-leaning publication. But that's the only thing I found in this country that might fit that model of being used for propaganda.
Sorry to harp on going back to Soviet Union, but you said his father, his uncle, and someone else were executed. So once again, it's kind of like, well, why would he want to go? I mean, I kind of get going back to the motherland, but somehow after that, I was thinking, I want to go back.
Well, it seems clear that he didn't know that. That essentially in the late 30s, that was the time of the Great Terror in the Soviet Union. Lots of people were being executed, thousands and thousands. And it became very unsafe for anyone in the Soviet Union to send letters to the US. And so he got no more letters from his family at a certain point. And apparently, he didn't learn about what had happened to his family until after he had emigrated and arrived there in Mariupol. But even then, the truth was not being told to the families of those who were executed. They knew that their family member had disappeared, but sometimes, and I don't know this was true of his family, but sometimes family members were told, you know, your family member was in prison and died there, without being told how they died. And we only know, you know, since the opening of the Soviet archives, some of the details of these so-called trials and executions during that Great Terror.
I didn't realize it was so long. I mean, that's a long time.
Yeah.
He went back in the 50s?
He went back in '63.
So that was like 30 years.
And he actually went back, he and Lydia went back for a visit in about 1961. But even then, he wasn't able to meet his sister because she wasn't able to travel to Donetsk. And Lydia and Victor were not able to travel to Mariupol because it was off limits to foreigners. And so he did meet his niece in 1961, but whether she told him anything about their family members, she may not have even known herself what had happened to them, just that they disappeared one night.
What happened with his two sons? Did he ever reconcile? What did they do in life?
Yes. He had three sons, Michael, Vasily, and Jacob. He and Michael became rather alienated from his parents at an early age. He felt that they were spending all their time in party meetings and not spending any time with him. So he's still alive. And he and I talked on the telephone, we exchanged emails back and forth. He said that when he was in high school at George Washington High School, he spent a lot of time in the library. The public library that's nearby there. And he got very interested in electronics, and he made a career in electronics. And by the 1950s and 60s, he was working on projects that were classified. And so after Victor moved to the Soviet Union, Michael wasn't able to write to him, and he didn't write to Michael. Vasily went to UC Berkeley, got a degree in journalism, couldn't find a job in journalism, taught journalism in a high school up in Humboldt County somewhere for a while, and wasn't making a very good living at that, so he became a longshoreman. And he spent the rest of his life as a member of ILWU Local 10. Vasily was probably the closest to Victor in his politics, but as Victor once wrote to Vasily from the Soviet Union, "You're not a good candidate for union office, Vasily. You are a liberal, and liberals have no business holding office in unions." He wanted, of course, communists holding office in unions. But he and Vasily continued to get along well. Vasily visited him several times in the Soviet Union. And every time that Vasily visited, Victor would send him a list of things to bring. You know, bring me a new pair of glasses from my optometrist. Bring me all of these kinds of paints that I'm not able to get here. Bring me these kinds of medicines for his second wife, who had problems with rheumatism or arthritis, not clear. Jacob was the third son, and he was probably the most alienated from his parents. But very late, about 1978 or so, his second wife, who was a social worker, convinced him that he needed to go visit his father in the Soviet Union and mend the rift between them. And I interviewed her. Both Vasily and Jacob died before I started this project, but I interviewed his second wife, and she said it was a good visit, and that she had the impression that Victor thought he'd made a mistake in going to live there, that he regretted the lack of freedom he had living in the Soviet Union. But He never revealed that in any of his letters to Vasily. I have all of his letters, or most of his letters to Vasily. And in his letters, he speaks of, "Come and visit me, this is the worker's paradise." And for him, it really worked out very well. You know, he probably was at least as well off in the Soviet Union as he would have been living on Social Security in Colma, where their house was. He'd never had a new car in his entire life until he moved to the Soviet Union. But he was very privileged, and I don't know how much he recognized the degree of privilege he had living in the Soviet Union. Asked the Stanford Art Museum that, and they said, no, we don't have any. And they don't even have a file on him. Which to me, you know, what does that say? There he was, he is a member of that art faculty for 25 years, 26 years. He exhibited in that museum constantly, and they don't even care, clearly. There's a number of his works on paper at the Arnautoff Foundation at the Palace of the Legion of Honor, including some things from Coit Tower. The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art has one of his oil paintings and several of his works on paper. There are 3 lunettes in the library of the San Francisco Art Institute that he did, but the Art Institute has deaccessioned some of the paintings that they held. You know, I think there was a time when his work simply wasn't popular. And so art museums began deaccessioning his things and making a little bit of money on the side. Today, you can find some of his oil paintings for sale in galleries for $15,000. Those are really good ones, by the way. Yes.
You have a question down here, and another question back there.
So are any of the paintings that were on sale in galleries in your book?
There are a lot of illustrations in the book, both black and white and color. There's a color section at the end. And some of them from galleries are there. The family, his grandson, Pete, has a large collection of Victor's things that he received from his father, Vasily. And some of them have been sold by the Spencer Helfand Gallery in Los Angeles. If you look them up on the internet, you can see pictures there of all of the things that they've handled, both the ones they've sold and the ones that are still for sale.
You also mentioned some that he brought with him to the Soviet Union.
Yes, what happened to those? After his death, his widow there offered some of them to the Russian Museum, or the Russian State Museum in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. This is one of the 2 largest museums of art by Russians in Russia, and they have a couple of his things, and I have a reproduction of one of them from that museum in the book. The rest of his things really scattered after his widow's death. So apparently there's a nephew of his, or maybe a grandnephew of his, that has some of them. There's an art critic who I met when I was in St. Petersburg and had a very long conversation with, an art critic who knew Victor and who has some of Victor's things. There were a number of his things that were destroyed at one point when their dacha was broken into and somebody just randomly went around breaking up works of art and plates and that sort of thing. If you just go online and enter Victor Arnautoff, both with FF or V at the end, because the Russian spelling is with a V at the end, you'll find some of his work for sale in galleries in St. Petersburg, as well as in galleries all over in New York, and I think I saw one in Amsterdam once.
Arnautoff was born in Ukraine. Did he consider himself Ukrainian or Russian?
Russian. His family, his father was of apparently remote Albanian descent and had come to Russia with a Greek colony, but had married with Russians. His mother's family traced part of their ancestry to an English engineer who Peter the Great brought to Russia, but the rest of her ancestry was Cossack, and he considered himself Russian.
Of all the places that Arnautoff could have studied art, do you know how he chose or why he ended up in San Francisco?
Why in San Francisco? Because of the art school. You know, he came here for the California School of Fine Arts. I think that was the major attraction, but there was also a very large Russian community here of refugees who had fled the Civil War, first gone to Harbin, and then from Harbin to San Francisco. If you go to the Russian Center that's down in the Western Addition, they have a big history museum there that's only open sometimes, but they have a lot of information about all of the families that came from Russia through Manchuria to San Francisco. So it was a path that others had taken before him, including, and I can't prove this, but there were at least 2 students at the California School of Fine Arts, Russians, who had been officers in the same White Army as Arnautoff. Whether he knew them or not, I don't have any evidence. He knew them once he came here. They may have also given him information about coming here, but there's no records for that.
The Russian Center Library and Museum is open Tuesday and Thursday, 10 to 2 on Sutter near Divisadero. And they also have an exhibit of the Trans-Siberian Railroad with the Great Eastern China Railroad.
Yep. Thank you very much.
One more? Okay, 2 more.
How would somebody way down in Ukraine hook up with the 5th Lithuanian Cavalry in the upper left-hand corner up there?
Well, the fact that it was called the 5th Lithuanian Cavalry had nothing to do with the composition of the unit. And the name of it was even more complex because it was the 5th Lithuanian Cavalry in honor of the King of Italy. And many of the Russian military units were named in honor of, there's a Russian term, imeni, meaning, named in honor of the various heads of allied countries. But the Lithuanian unit had probably, at some remote time, been Lithuanian. But at least in the 50 or 100 years before Arnautoff was assigned to it, it had been stationed in Simbirsk on the Volga River, a very long ways away from Lithuania.
One more.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Cherny, for your work. It was really admirable and very important story. I'm wondering if in your research you came across a San Francisco organization called Artist.Equity. My father was a friend of Arnautoff and also active in Artist.Equity, and I would think this might have been one of the organizations that helped defend Arnautoff in Stanford, etc.
Arnautoff in the late 30s was a member of a CIO union for artists. And I don't know if there was any connection between that organization and Artist.Equity. I think there may have been. I'm not sure. But when Arnautoff's murals came under attack at George Washington High School, Artist.Equity was one of those organizations which sought to defend him. I'd like to talk to you if your father knew Arnautoff.
At this point, if you have any other questions, we can look to Bob. Thank you